plans for yourself at the present time?
No. No, I'm in retirement now, I'm afraid.
I suppose since Mr. Hardy's death, you have received phone calls and a good deal of correspondence of condolence and sympathy from fans and people you've never known.
Oh, yes. One thing I've always done is answer every fan letter. Not always a letter, if it was necessary for a letter, yes. But always acknowledge the letters and sent pictures. I've attended to all our fan mail personally.
Yourself?
Yeah, and in autographing them, I've included their name and everything.
Very considerate.
For all the years, all through the years, even in a crowd. And I think that it brought a closeness to people. They felt that they were our friend, we were their friend.
Right.
And the minute they saw us, absolutely changed. Hello, Stan, you know. Hello, Bill. Hello, George. We were just one of the family.
Yes.
I got so many, many letters where they frame even a little postcard hanging in the home. It's
wonderful. Wonderful.
In this same interview given by Arthur B. Friedman in 1957, the interviewee, the great comedian Stanley Laurel, recalled how a fan had sent him a letter telling him that he had only been given 2 or 3 days left to live, but the man wanted to thank him for how much joy and laughter Laurel and Hardy had given him in his life. This letter, in Stanley Laurel's own words, really flipped him out, and that he did not even have the opportunity to reply back. Laurel and Hardy's fans in one sense were almost like distant family because of the bond developed. Although this bond made through cinema, it transcended it and was like a vessel bringing Laurel and Hardy to people around the world. This affinity that people felt for Laurel and Hardy showed how they appreciated and enjoyed their work. Stanley Laurel, in the same interview, also said it was a wonderful and heartwarming experience that they were able to entertain so many people. One of the main reasons this interview was being held was that sadly, only 1 week before, Oliver Hardy had passed away, this marking the end of the great comedy duo, Laurel and Hardy. Stanley spoke of how he had received letters of condolences from fans around the world and how this had warmed his heart. For over 30 years, Laurel and Hardy had been a great double act and in their time one of the most popular comedy duos in cinema. Stanley Laurel, like many of his peers and counterparts such as W.C. Fields, the Marx Brothers, Mae West, Charlie Chaplin, the Three Stooges and many more, had developed their crafts and skills performing on stage. Indeed, if it were not for the combining of stage entertainment and cinema, Laurel and Hardy may have never been known around the world, and certainly would not have had their performances and craft recorded for the present and future generations to view and enjoy. These comedians and entertainers were around in a very specific time in the history of comedy and cinema. Their careers, and many performers, actors, singers and comedians like them, crafted their skills in theatre that was known as vaudeville, music hall or variety. Today, if we are to think of stars such as Laurel and Hardy or the Marx Brothers or Charlie Chaplin, then we would usually only connect them to the films in which they starred. This is what they are famous for and what most people associate with them. It is important to know, however, that these entertainers started their careers in vaudeville, variety shows and music hall. Indeed, in the 1920s and 1930s, nearly all the big stars of cinema had started in stage entertainment. Oliver Hardy was a rare exception to this, for he had not had a career in vaudeville, although he had been a tenor and had sung in some vaudeville theatres. The term variety show was used in America and Britain for stage entertainment. However, Later in America, it was to be known specifically as vaudeville. The term music hall has also been customarily used for a British form of variety stage entertainment. It is believed that the term vaudeville itself, referring specifically to American variety entertainment, came into common usage after 1871 with the formation of Sergeant's Great Vaudeville Company of Louisville, Kentucky. This had little, if nothing, to do at all with the vaudeville of French theatre. Originally it was called variety, but the exotic French word vaudeville seemed to attract more people. Before radio, movies and television, most theatres around North America presented vaudeville shows. Every place from big cities to small towns had its own vaudeville house. It was mainly presented in theatres, but anywhere that could stage a vaudeville show in front of people could be used, such as town halls or open public places. The word vaudeville was originally derived from two French phrases, Val de Vert, which meant Valley of the River Vert, and Vox de Ville, which meant Voices of the Town. The valley was a place where people would entertain each other in the evenings with ballads, folk songs and general merrymaking. In the city streets, popular theatre gave rise to the Théâtre du Vaudeville in Paris in 1792. This form of entertainment was European to begin with, and due to the large amount of European immigrants that starred in vaudeville, European influences were strong. But once started in America, it developed a style all of its own. Starting in saloons in the west and east of America, many different acts were put on to entertain the customers and to bring in money. But many of the shows could be quite rude and were not considered as being a form of family entertainment. American variety stage entertainment in the late 1880s was going through a process of transformation. Stage shows, dime museums and burlesque shows were changing into a new industrialized form of entertainment that was to be known as vaudeville. A founder of this type of show was Tony Pastor. Born in 1837 and initially a circus ringmaster whose dream was to turn the rough and ready world of variety into a spectacle for all the family. His opening show in this vein, in a theatre in the 14th Street to Manny Hall, was held on the 17th of February 1881. Tony Pastor wanted to make stage entertainment for all the family. This appealed to a growing middle class, and the term vaudeville was associated with entertainment for all the family and proved to be very popular. Vaudeville took off and eventually became industrialized across North America, where there were huge audiences. In 1885, two ex-gritters, Edward Franklin Albee and Benjamin Franklin Keith, inaugurated their first continuous performances theatre in Boston, admission $1 dime. It wasn't till this time, in the mid-1880s, that vaudeville was to become the most popular form of entertainment in North America for almost 50 years, dating its birth from around this time and lasting until around 1932, when what is considered a symbolic death knell when the New York Palace Theatre converted from a vaudeville theatre to only showing movies. Vaudeville was the entertainment of its day, and at its peak around 2 million people saw vaudeville acts every day, of which there were at least 20,000 different acts. And some of the most famous names in entertainment from the past century came from vaudeville. People such as Buster Keaton, who had begun performing when he was a child with his parents. Harry Houdini, who started his career by doing magic tricks on stage in sideshows and dime museums. He was eventually spotted doing a handcuff trick and was hired to perform in the Orpheum Vaudeville circuit, where his fame grew, and he was soon performing as top billing in vaudeville theatres across North America. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, or more commonly known as Fatty Arbuckle, was one of the biggest stars of silent film. He started his career on stage at a young age as a singer, but also as a comedian who excelled in slapstick and general clowning around. Max Sennett gave him his first chance at Keystone Studios, and he became one of Max Sennett's biggest stars. He was soon to move on to Paramount Pictures, where he became one of the biggest grossing film stars of silent cinema. Charlie Chaplin also channeled his skill straight from musical and vaudeville to cinema. Charlie Chaplin is generally considered to be the first big star of silent films, and indeed cinema. However, he was a big star of the stage beforehand, and this was how he was recognised as being a potential star for film. He of course became one of the biggest, if not the biggest star of silent film of his time. However, he only released 2 films in the 1930s, one of which he started making in the late 1920s. This film, City Lights, released in 1931, was Chaplin's last silent film. It is said that he wanted to stay with the silent method and at first resisted sound in film. The world's most popular performer saw immediately that with the advent of sound technology coming into cinema, this would force him to come to terms with his little tramp character. The role had evolved from English musical and was, Chaplin believed, essentially pantomimic and therefore silent. Chaplin was also wary of his pronounced British accent, which he feared would work against the universality of the character. It is, though, the silent films where his comedic skills are most strongly recognised. Whereas the 1930s were a prolific time for many other comedians with the added technology of sound, Chaplin's career wasn't quite as big as it had been in the 20s. As where Groucho Marx never appeared in a silent movie that got released, although he was in a silent film the Marx Brothers made themselves called Humoresque, but this never got released and the footage has been lost. And Stanley Laurel was not a big star of silent film, although he did appear in and direct silent movies. Stanley Laurel and Groucho Marx were to become big stars of talkie comedies in the 1930s. The 30s saw the rise of many great comedians, and nearly all of them coming from a stage background. It is worth also noting that Mae West was one of the biggest female stars of the 30s, and she also started in vaudeville and later went on to Broadway. Mae West's first 2 starring pictures for Paramount, She Done Him Wrong, 1933, and I'm No Angel, also 1933, grossed $2.3 and $2.2 million respectively, and became the studio's biggest hits of the decade. There were, of course, many other people involved in vaudeville and the creation of cinema. Chaplin or Laurel might not have ever had the opportunity to be big stars on screen if it had not been for a man called Fred Karno. Indeed, Stanley Laurel himself said that his form of comedy could be defined as Karnoism, and Karnoism has had a huge influence on comedy in the 20th and 21st century. Fred Karno was born in 1866 and began his stage life as a clown, mime artist and gymnast in the 1880s and 1890s. One of his main performances was to walk the tightrope. He formed an act called the Three Karnos and went on to tour music halls in Britain and around Europe. And although he himself following on many traditions of comedy that dated back to the court jester and before, he was key in developing many famous comedians and their careers. Fred Karno found he could make more money putting on shows than performing himself, and he pursued this to its limits. He had a strict work ethic and demanded dedication and excellence in the acts that were to perform under his name. This was where Charlie Chaplin and Stanley Laurel were to get their first big breaks, for they joined the Karno troupe, and this was their first steps to fame. Vaudeville and music hall had a large effect on film, but film in turn would have its influence on stage traditions. This was partly due to audience expectations and the skill of the people that were behind making the first films. The influences of great comedy directors and producers like Hal Roach cannot be underestimated. Hal Roach was a writer, director, and producer of all-round great skill. It was at his studio that Laurel and Hardy had both worked separately and were eventually teamed together. Roach produced a large amount of Laurel and Hardy films. These films were considered the best films that they ever made. Roach himself had started in the movie business by being a technical advisor for Western movies, although he had lived in upstate New York and as a young man had gone to Alaska to work as a gold prospector and mule skinner. He also worked as an extra for a while, and this is where he met another great comedian, Harold Lloyd. After inheriting a small amount of money, he set up his first own production company in 1914. But the first films that he made, he could not find a distributor. Roach reformed the company later in that year, and from here the company started to be successful, Harold Lloyd being the main star to begin with in the first films that were produced. Around the same time, another great comedic filmmaker, Max Sennett, had started running the Keystone Film Company, which was formed in 1912. Sennett himself had set out to be a singer, but not having much luck in this field, he joined a growing film company, Biograph. Sennett was inquisitive, ambitious, ingenious. He studied D.W. Griffith's work and was determined to be a director himself. Griffith, with whom Sennett worked with at Biograph, was his mentor in film. Sennett learned all about editing, staging and camera placing from the star director. To augment his income by writing scenarios, he recognised his natural bent for comedy, and he took note of the success of the anarchic knockabout comedy films imported from France. It was from this start at Biograph that he was signed up to run Keystone Studio, an offshoot of the New York Motion Picture Company. From this, he went on to be a very successful director, creating his own specific form of slapstick comedy. Amongst his most famous creations were the Keystone Cops and, of course, his discovery of Charlie Chaplin. So the comic stars and the filmmakers all contributed towards the creation of early film comedy. The importance of the part that stage entertainment played cannot be underestimated, and cinema in the 20s and the 30s would not have been the same if it were not for vaudeville. Before the advent of modern forms of entertainment such as cinema, one of the main sources of entertainment was to go out and watch a stage show. Stage shows, whether they were variety, burlesque, vaudeville or music hall, were a culturally popular form of entertainment. One of the strongholds of stage entertainment was comedy, and from the stage many comedians were produced that are still known and famous today. There was a natural path from the vaudeville and musical stage act to the new form of technology that was bringing entertainment to mass audiences in the 1920s and 30s. This new technology, of course, being cinema. Stage entertainment's influence on cinema in North America was huge. In fact, it can be considered that film was the new stage for the early comedians to practice their arts and their craft. There is no question that early film comedy was the domain of the stage performer. All the jokes, gestures and slapstick that was learnt on stage was then transferred onto cinema. Chaplin's famous walk, Laurel's use of the famous double take reactions, the Marx Brothers' wit and style, all this was learnt, performed on stage and then continued onto film. Stage comedy influenced comedic film in every area, but at the same time, film would slowly influence comedy. When Charlie Chaplin encountered the camera at Max Sennett's Keystone Studio, he realised in a few short months the special relationship between the camera and the actor, a relationship not with a communal audience, but with each individual within it. Chaplin saw the qualities of film and what could be done with it. You could do things with film that you couldn't do on stage, and film could be seen in more places than anyone could ever perform themselves. You could put storylines and feelings into film that represent a view and what could be a personal view. Film could be used to portray all manner of comedic styles, and in this sense it was used not only as a platform to perform, but in a format of its own right that called for the use of its own methods. This idea related to the old traditions of the stage and the new traditions of cinema, creating a whole new form of entertainment. Stage traditions, in this sense, were cultivated and evolved a whole life of their own in the cinema.